Hello YouTube, this is Frank from Architecture Aesthetics, and I just want to let you guys know that I'm starting a new series in which I'll be using watercolor to paint a plethora of religious buildings, and I'll be taking this as an exercise for me to improve my watercolor architecture rendering skills. And without further ado, let's get into today's content. Alright guys, so the subject of today's video is the Hagia Sophia, located in Istanbul, Turkey. And the intention of today's video is not going to be a historical walkthrough of this architectural project. I trust that most of you know the historical significance of this building and how much of an engineering feat it is. I believe till this day it is still the building that hosts the largest human constructed dome, and in order to build that dome they had to come up with a new architectural element, which is the pendentives. And how they build the dome is that they have to first build a series of, to be more exact, 4 massive arches. Atop of these 4 massive arches, it is where they constructed the dome and connected the dome with the arches with the pendentives. And the first stage is always to lay a very precise, very meticulously constructed pencil framework. And as you can see, I'm just taking my time to really get the form correct. And as you can see, when I'm drawing the dome, I'm also paying attention to the correctness of my construction drawing, meaning I'm dissecting this dome into a few different ellipses. And I just feel like this is always a good exercise for you to really understand the form of a very monumental architecture. I really appreciate this kind of symmetrical or highly geometrical scheme of an architecture. It's very similar to that of Andrea Palladio's projects, in the sense that once you've seen one facade, because of the design is so rational, you can work out how this project is going to look like from the other orthogonal views. Whereas if you have some very chaotic postmodern architecture, you couldn't do that logically. At this point, I'm drawing the 4 spires, or the 4 towers of the Hagia Sophia, which stands for the Church of the Holy Wisdom. I would say that these 4 spires, these 4 towers, are very iconic in the sense that it delimits the visual boundary of this architecture. It imbues this project with a very solemn atmosphere. And right here, I'm just adding more details to emphasize the connection details between the massive arches and the body of the dome. Okay, right here I'm still working on the pencil layout, but you can see that I'm intentionally adding the line weight variations so that from a very fast glance you can still tell the form of different shapes just based on the variation of the width of the line, so that thicker lines indicates the outer edge of a form, whereas thinner lines are going to be perceived as detail lines, such as windows, traceries, and all that kind of details. And here it is one of the, I would say, challenges of this project, which is to visually depict the windows on the body of the dome. And the windows of the Hagia Sophia's dome is one of those instances where brilliant engineers convert a problem into an ingenious architectural solution. And the story goes that the dome was so massive that it was posing some risk of collapsing onto itself, and the engineers came up with this idea of adding windows so that the hollowed out part is going to deduct from the weight of the dome, and it also lights up the interior beautifully, so that it's kind of killing two birds with one stone. And I would say that this is one of the challenges of this project, because you're really drawing these little very small windows around the dome, and you have to pay attention to the perspective of how the windows diminish in size as it's going around the circular spherical structure of the dome. And right here I'm adding lines to indicate the silhouette of the greeneries and foliage in the foreground. And now we're starting to color this image. And as you can see, this is the first wash. I'm just using some red and orangey colors to give a base wash to the body of the massive arches. And coloring and the first wash is always very delightful, because watercolor is a very strange medium. When you're first coloring it during the first wash, before the water has completely dried, the color is going to be very saturated. And however, after a while, after the water had been dried from the pigment, it's gonna fade a lot, and the saturation is going to have a very drastic drop. And as you can see here, after the water had dried from the pigment, it looks so much lighter than when we were actually doing the wash. And that is what makes watercolor such a treacherous medium, because you really need to gauge how many layers of washes you need to apply based on your experience. At this point, I'm using some cool colors, meaning blue, to indicate the shadow area of the arches. And just because I have picked out a lot of blue and applied it to my color mixing area, I am also using the same pigment to color areas that have similar shades, similar hues to the cool colors of the arches, namely the rooftops of the surrounding areas, which also has a lot of blue in it. And right here I'm adding more darker shades of blue and go over the rooftops of the dome and the top portion of the 4 spires. And at this point I'm coloring the body of the spires, and also mixing the red and the blue color to go over the darker portions of the main body of the building. And after I have finished that, to not waste the red color that we have mixed, I use some of them to indicate the reddish colors in the foliage that is in the foreground. And after that is done, you can see I am mixing a lot of green color to depict the foliage and the greeneries. And I would like to point out that this area is a good representation of how the wet on dry technique is done, meaning you don't pre-wet a painting surface, you just lay down the wet paint, and before it has the time to dry, you are adding more wet pigments into it so the color blends beautifully together. And I'm just using the same technique to color the rest of the foliage. And right here I'm adding more variations to the foliage in terms of the luminosity of the colors. Adding a few more detailed touches, using colder color to indicate the shadow areas. And now I'm starting to paint the sky. And the way I painted the sky is a good demonstration of how the wet on wet technique works. And the gist of it is that you use a clean brush with a lot of water to pre-wet the sky area. And before the wet area has the time to dry, you use another brush, load a lot of desired blue color to go over the wet area. And the result of this technique is a very subtle, very clear, very cloudy kind of wash, which really does a good representation of how we see the sky. And that's pretty much all I have to say in terms of the techniques of this video. In terms of any area of improvement, I would say that in terms of the overall value, the painting is still very thinly saturated, meaning that the saturation isn't there. And the reason why it is this way is because I haven't layered enough layers to really bring up the saturation. And in the future project, which you guys are going to see in the next week, hopefully you can see that after I learned the importance of really building up the layers by laying down multiple layers of washes, the image is going to look a lot more realistic. Alright guys, I hope all of you liked today's video. Please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to more watercolor architectural rendering videos. And I'll see all of you in next week's video. Bye bye.